see so many people joining in. We're just at 1:59 p.m. Central Time, so we'll give another minute or so to allow others to join. But thank you for attending and listening into our overview of Indigenous trauma and resilience. Really appreciate it. And, Dr. Beising or Christina, any thoughts or comments before we get started in about a minute or so?
Yes, thank you all for attending. There will be time for some questions at the end. So until then, please mute yourself.
All right, well, we already have, looks like 57 people connected in. Really appreciate everyone taking time on a Friday afternoon to attend our Indigenous Trauma and Resilience Research Center seminar. My name is Dr. Donald Warne. I am a family physician and also have training in public health and health policy. And I wear a number of hats at University of North Dakota School of Medicine and Health Sciences. I'm Associate Dean for Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion. I'm also chair of our very innovative Department of Indigenous Health here at the School of Medicine and Health Sciences. And within the department, we have several educational programs, including InMed, our Indians into Medicine program, which is clinical training. And we also have our PhD in Indigenous Health, which is more on the research, evaluation, and policy training. It's good to see a couple of our students are also on the call as well. Just wonderful to see each of you. And also we have several research projects, and the one that we'll be talking about today is the Indigenous Trauma and Resilience Research Center. So I'll go ahead and share my screen. Excuse me. So again, I'm Dr. Donald Warne. I'm Oglala Lakota, originally from Kyle, South Dakota, on the Pine Ridge Indian Reservation. And very pleased and honored to serve in these capacities here at the University of North Dakota. And as we know, we do suffer from terrible health disparities as American Indian populations, much like other indigenous populations around the world. We tend to see significant disparities. And for those of us who've been working in this space for a number of decades, I think much of the challenge that we see is unresolved trauma. And we'll talk about the different types of trauma that our people endure, not just physical trauma, but psychological trauma, emotional trauma, and even spiritual trauma, and the loss of sacred places, loss of land and resources, loss of culture and language. All of these things ultimately have an impact on health. So our goal through this work is to not just identify the disparities that are associated with trauma, but to identify strategies to do something about it. And so much of our culture and the connectivity we have to holism and health, I think really needs to be a part of the solution as we move things forward. So for our discussion today, we have about an hour together. I won't use the entire time because I'd love to leave time at the end for some questions and discussion. But I'll go through some of our projects here, but also the basis for this wonderful research center that is now about a year old, funded through the National Institutes of Health. But as we get started, I always like to start with our land acknowledgement. And UND is one of the first universities in this region to have a formal land acknowledgement. And it states, today the University of North Dakota rests on the ancestral lands of the Pembina and Red Lake bands of Ojibwe and the Dakota Oyate, presently existing as composite parts of the Red Lake, Turtle Mountain, White Earth bands, and the Dakota tribes of Minnesota and North Dakota. We acknowledge the people who resided here for generations and recognize that the spirit of the Ojibwe and Oyate people permeates this land. As a university community, we will continue to build upon our relations with the First Nations of the state of North Dakota, the Mandan, Hidatsa, and Arikara Nation, Sisseton, Wahpeton, Oyate Nation, Spirit Lake Nation, Standing Rock Sioux Tribe, and Turtle Mountain Band of Chippewa Indians. And again, very proud of UND for moving forward and having a land acknowledgement and recognizing the indigenous peoples who are still here in North Dakota. So on this map, you can see UND is located in the northeastern corner of North Dakota. And you can see the various tribal nations that also call North Dakota home. So Turtle Mountain, Spirit Lake, MHA Nation, Standing Rock, and Sisseton, Wahpeton, Oyate. And two of the tribes, Standing Rock and Sisseton, Wahpeton, you can see are located in both North Dakota and South Dakota. So I think it's also important to understand the terminology that we use. And I'm sure most of us are familiar with the term American Indian and Alaska Native. And I think we need to really understand, why is it that we have American Indian and Alaska Native? And recognizing that the American Indian populations are basically the indigenous populations, primarily in the 48 states in the central part of North America. We also have indigenous populations in Hawaii, the 50th state, but the native Hawaiians are considered Pacific Islanders, so a different racial group, even though they are indigenous Americans. And also for the indigenous people of Alaska, we have to recognize that some of them are culturally American Indian. For example, Athabascans in central Alaska are American Indians culturally. And there are Athabascans throughout North America. They're in not just Alaska, but also in Canada, parts of California. And actually the Navajo and Apache tribes in Arizona are also Athabascan. So the Athabascan American Indian cultural group is really ubiquitous across North America. But there are other Alaska Native populations that are very different culturally. So for example, the Yupiks and the Inuit populations are more of a circumpolar population. So they're around the North Pole and around the Arctic region. So the Inuits, for example, exist in Alaska, but also in Siberia, Canada, and Greenland. So they are indigenous to Alaska, but they are not American Indians. So that's why we have the racial group American Indian and Alaska Native. And we also have to think about enrolled tribal members, and that there's a subset of self-identified American Indians, Alaska Natives, who are also formally enrolled members of their tribal nations. So we have to recognize that American Indian, Alaska Native is a racial designation through the US Census, but enrolled tribal membership is actually a political designation. And most of the Indian Health Service data uses enrolled tribal members who use IHS. So when we think about the data that we use for research, we have to be very careful about what's the denominator that we're using, what is the group. So if we're using just IHS data, we're not capturing all American Indians and Alaska Natives. But if we're using, for example, tribal data, we're also not necessarily capturing the entire population. So that's one of the things we have to be cognizant of when we're conducting research with indigenous peoples, is what is the data set and how inclusive is that data set? So we'll talk a little more about that as we move forward. And of course, we've all heard the term Native American, and we see the terms used interchangeably quite a bit, American Indian and Native American, but they are actually different terms and they have different legal definitions. So Native Americans, according to the Native American Programs Act in 1978, includes American Indians and Alaska Natives, but also includes Native Hawaiians and indigenous peoples of US territories. So American Samoans are Native American. Also the Chamorro groups in Guam, the indigenous peoples of Guam, the territory of Guam, are also Native Americans from a legal perspective. So I was trying to be careful about the terminology that I use and the population that we're really talking about. So it's interesting, on the US Census, I checked the box American Indian and Alaska Native, but I'm not Alaska Native, right? We're just kind of lumped together, so I'm American Indian. I am also an enrolled tribal member of the Oglala Lakota Nation, and I am Native American. But when I say Native American, we also have to recognize we're including other indigenous Americans, not just American Indians. So I've heard a lot of arguments over the years about what's the better term. Is it American Indian or is it Native American? And the argument against American Indian is that that term came from Columbus because he thought that he was in India. So that's why we have American Indians. And that's why we have Indian Health Service and Bureau of Indian Affairs largely because Columbus was lost at sea and thought he was in India. Therefore, I'm an American Indian. So a lot of people don't like that term, understandably. But even if we think about the term Native American, the word American comes from another Italian explorer, Amerigo Vespucci. So, he was one of the Italian explorers who came over to what is now the Americas, but he named it after himself. So because of Amerigo Vespucci, it's now North America, right? So in many ways, if we're arguing about which is the better term, American Indian or Native American, we're actually arguing about which Italian explorer do we want to pay homage to? Is it Columbus or Vespucci? So actually what we've been using is the term indigenous. It's much more inclusive. And the indigenous peoples are the original inhabitants of various parts of the globe. So the indigenous peoples in what is now North Dakota includes the Oyate, Lakota, Dakota peoples, also Ojibwe groups like the Anishinaabe groups as well, and Mandan, Hidatsa, Arikara. So there's many tribal groups that are indigenous to North Dakota, but it is much more inclusive of the global population of indigenous people. So that's the terminology that we tend to use here at UAB. When we think about the cultural groups in North America that are indigenous, there's a great deal of diversity. And that's another thing that needs to be considered and kept in mind when we're developing research projects or educational programs, is that there's not a single indigenous population or a single indigenous culture. There's many, many cultures that are indigenous to what is now North America. So if we think about, for example, the continent of Europe, there's many languages, many cultures, and a lot of diversity in Europe. And we have at least that much diversity in North America when we're looking at our indigenous populations. So I think that's an important starting point, just to think about the populations that we're talking about and the terminology that we use. So again, our research center is the Indigenous Trauma and Resilience Research Center. And when we think about what is now the United States, and we look at the American Indian and Alaska Native population, there's only 7 states that have at least 3% American Indian or Alaska Native population, just 7. So that includes Alaska, Montana, North Dakota, South Dakota, Arizona, New Mexico, and Oklahoma. And for those who might be from Alaska, I apologize. I know Alaska is not off the coast of California, but that's the map that we have just to look at the distribution of population. So when we look at this map, we recognize that the indigenous people of North America, at least in what is now the United States, the vast majority of us are in the western half of the United States. And why is that? Why is it that most American Indians and Alaska Natives are in the western part of the US? Well, there are historical reasons for this, and this relates to many of the historical traumas that our populations have had to endure. So when we think about trauma, and I was so happy to see that people from behavioral health programs are on the call as well. When we think about trauma, of course, we can think about physical trauma, right? And we have trauma centers that deal with physical injuries. And much of the research and the work in recent years has been looking at emotional and psychological trauma. So looking at traumatic events that could be mental or emotional impacts. And this could be, one-time events, a significant injury, perhaps a death of someone who is close to you, or a significant loss. Those can be one-time events that can cause traumatic responses. One of the things that we observe in our tribal nations, and that I really think is at the root of much of our health disparities, is toxic stress. And it's that ongoing kind of relentless stress that is creating emotional and psychological trauma. So just living within poverty is very stressful. Living in circumstances where there's domestic violence or potentially social isolation, that can be very stressful. I think the pandemic has been very stressful across the board, but some populations are even more impacted than others. And in truth, when we look at COVID-19, I wish we had never used the term social distancing, right? When we say 6 feet apart, that's a physical distance, not a social distance. And one of the outcomes is that we're seeing more social isolation, and not surprisingly, more mental health and more addiction challenges and more overdose since 2020. largely because of expanded social isolation due to the pandemic. Another ongoing stressor is chronic illness. And with our high rates of chronic disease in many of our tribal populations, people are dealing with chronic illness, chronic pain, and ongoing stressors. So we have to think of this not just in terms of the stress of the chronic illness, but what is the ongoing impact of that type of trauma? And then just at the societal level, you know, internationally, of course, we're dealing with war, we're dealing with challenges in politics. We still have racism that we deal with. I wish that we didn't, but we do. So these are really ongoing relentless stressors that have an impact on the health of populations. And much of the work that we've been doing in recent years is also looking at childhood trauma and recognizing when there's adverse childhood experiences, we tend to see worse health status during adulthood. So much of the research in recent years has been focusing on emotional and psychological trauma. But for Indigenous populations, we also have to recognize that there's spiritual trauma as well. When we have loss of land and loss of language, loss of culture. And I apologize, there's a train going by, so hopefully you can still hear me fine. But we've had challenges related to tremendous loss of things that are important to us, and that land-based connection with the earth and with each other is really meaningful. And when that gets disrupted, it has an ongoing impact on the health of our people. So we have to recognize that loss of traditional foods, loss of traditional lifestyle, loss of ceremony and language and sacred places does have an impact on the health of our people. So this is really kind of the framework for trying to understand our disparities, but even more importantly, what can we do to address this and improve outcomes? So this is really at the root of our Indigenous Trauma and Resilience Research Center. So when we think about holistic perspectives on trauma, we can use the medicine wheel symbol to better understand this. And again, if we're thinking about a trauma center and emergency room care, we think of physical trauma, right, like injuries. And then again, much of the work in recent years has been looking at mental or psychological trauma and emotional trauma. And really where we also need to address as we move forward is the arena of spiritual trauma. And again, loss of culture, loss of language, and loss of our traditions that can have an impact on holistic health for us as individuals and as populations. So I really like this graphic, kind of looking at the loss of land and territory over the years and over the centuries. And we know that colonization started in what is now the northeast of the United States. They're called the colonies for a reason, right? So the 13 colonies is really the root of colonization of Indigenous peoples. And what's really fascinating when you look around the world and we see colonization of Indigenous peoples, we tend to see very similar patterns in health outcomes that have endured even till today. So we see very similar patterns of health disparities for American Indians and Alaska Natives, but also First Nations people from Canada, Australian people or Aboriginal people in Australia, Maori people in New Zealand and other Pacific Islands. So we tend to see the same pattern of health disparities that is an ongoing intergenerational impact of colonization. So it's really fascinating. With our Indigenous health programming, we have, of course, our PhD in Indigenous health. We have an Indigenous health master public health specialization. And I think one of the things that we are really uncovering and understanding is that in many ways, your colonizer matters. So if we look at British colonies and what's now English-speaking Indigenous peoples, like American Indians, Alaska Natives, First Nations, Canadians, Aboriginal Australians, Maoris in New Zealand, the English-speaking Indigenous peoples tend to have the same pattern of disparities because there is the same pattern of colonization and boarding school or residential school implementation and marginalization and loss of resources. And that type of trauma over the years has a very similar impact on health disparities. So just very briefly here in North Dakota, the reason it's called North Dakota is that colonization came from the east. So the colonizers encountered the Dakotas first. And I would like to point out that if colonization had come from the West, this would have been the Lakota territory, and I'd work at UNL instead of UND. It would be North Dakota and South Dakota. But since colonization came from the East, they encountered the Dakotas first. And then our Oyate, which is Lakota, Dakota, Nakota. The Lakota were further west, and the Nakota were renamed Assiniboine. You may have heard of that tribe. They're further north in what is now Canada. So here in Grand Forks, the reason it's called Grand Forks, North Dakota, is that it is the confluence of the Red Lake River heading west and the Red River heading north. And this was a gathering point for Lakota and Dakota peoples. So long before we had highways, we had riverways for transportation. So every time I cross over the bridge and I see the Grand Forks, the confluence of those two rivers, I think to myself how beautiful that must have looked, with thousands of teepees and tens of thousands of people right here at Grand Forks. And then later in the summer, people would head north on the Red River. It's a north flowing river. And they'd go into what is now Lake Winnipeg and the city of Winnipeg. And there's a place in Winnipeg called the Forks. And that's where the Red River heading north meets the Assiniboine or Nakota River heading east. So this is another gathering point. So historically, between Grand Forks and Winnipeg, this really was a gathering place for our 7 Council of Fires, the Ocheti-Shakowee, and other tribal groups as well. So in many ways, it's a sacred place. And for those who've heard me speak before, I always like to point out the word Minnesota actually comes from 2 Dakota words. Mini means water, and Shota means smoky or cloudy. So with all of the waterways, the lakes and the rivers here in this region, we see this beautiful phenomenon when the weather changes in the fall and the spring, and it appears that the clouds are rising off of the water. So historically, this region was called Mini Shota Makoche, or the land where the clouds rise off of the water. Isn't that beautiful? The land where the clouds rise off of the water. But now we just call it Minnesota, right? So most people, I think, who live in this region don't actually know what the word means, but it's very descriptive and beautiful terminology for our space here. So we really need to think about this in historical context to really better understand the patterns of trauma that our people endure. But then again, even more importantly, what is it that we can do about it? So we can't change history, but we can develop interventions that account for history and colonization and trauma, but also include culturally relevant interventions. So as I mentioned, the 13 colonies were just really devastating to the Northeastern tribes. And one of the colonial leaders back at that time was Lord Jeffrey Amherst. So people have probably heard of Amherst, Massachusetts, and Amherst College. And Amherst was a colonial governor back in this time frame. And he's very famous in Indian country because he is the one who ordered the distribution of blankets from a smallpox hospital to the regional tribes with the purpose of killing them. So it's not a pleasant thing to think about or to talk about, but it's part of our history. And much of this part of the discussion is very difficult. I think a lot of people get uncomfortable thinking about these terrible events in US history. But I talk about these things not to make anyone feel bad. That is not the purpose. The reason to talk about these things is that if we're ever going to get to equity, we have to walk through truth, even when it's difficult and even when it makes us uncomfortable. So this is part of our truth and part of our history. And unfortunately, the individual who ordered the distribution of blankets that were infected with smallpox, we now honor him, right? We have a city named after him. We have colleges named after him, Lord Jeffrey Amherst. But if you're interested in learning more, you can just Google Amherst and smallpox. You can actually see the letter that he wrote. He's got lots of his writings are recorded now online. But this is in the pen of Jeffrey Amherst. I know it's in cursive and a little bit difficult to read, so I have it kind of translated here. And this is a letter from Amherst to one of the colonial army leaders. He said, "You will do well to try to inoculate the Indians by means of blankets, as well as to try every other method that can serve to extirpate or get rid of this execrable or horrible race." So extirpate this execrable race. I should be very glad your scheme for hunting them down by dogs. So this is just a horrible part of our history in the United States, but it's largely ignored in the history books. And that's because it kind of paints our history in a negative light, doesn't it? And again, it's not to make everyone feel bad. That's not the purpose, and that doesn't really serve any purpose. But we have to understand the truth of history to understand the truth of our disparities now. And if we're going to develop meaningful interventions and test them and study them, we have to know the truth of our history so we can get to health equity. That's part of our equity. In 1830, for those who have taken the American Indian Health Policy class through our program, you know that 1830 was the Indian Removal Act. And that was the law that removed tribal members from the southeast of the United States to what is now Oklahoma. So this time frame was also called the Trail of Tears. You may have heard of that term before. And in the process of removal, some of the tribal members refused to move. They stayed where they were from originally. Very understandable, they wanted to stay in their homelands. Where some of the tribal members were removed to Oklahoma. So that's why we have this interesting dynamic now where we have Seminoles in Florida and Seminoles in Oklahoma. We have Cherokees in North Carolina, Cherokees in Oklahoma, Choctaws in Mississippi, Choctaws in Oklahoma. So you get the idea. And of the 38 or so federally recognized tribes in Oklahoma, only 4 of them are originally from Oklahoma. The rest of them were removed from other parts of the country. And I know we have some people from Oklahoma on the call and the discussion today. So just think about the impact when you lose that deep-rooted cultural and spiritual connection to land and to place, and that positionality of how we are so deeply connected to where we are from. And for Indigenous peoples, that connection is very strong. And we recognize that the earth, the land upon which we live, it is the dust of our ancestors, and it's the building blocks of future generations. So what is the cultural and spiritual impact when people are removed forcibly from their homelands? And I think that part of that idea of historical trauma is that we're seeing the impact of that play out even in modern times with our health disparities across chronic disease as well as mental health considerations. Well, the discovery of gold was devastating for the California tribes. Many of the tribal nations in what is now California were wiped out during the gold rush, unfortunately. So this is what we have now. So I had shown the map previously that's statewide population data through the US Census. This is county level data, looking at Indigenous populations by county. And again, the 7 states with at least 3% American Indian or Alaska Native are Alaska, Montana, North Dakota, South Dakota, Arizona, New Mexico, and Oklahoma. But there's a reason for that. The original colonies and then the Indian Removal Act is the reason why the majority of our population really is in the western half of what is now the United States. And you can see there's just entire sections of the US that have less than 1% American Indian by county. There's some states where there's no counties that have at least 1% American Indians, even though the entire landscape at one time was indigenous. So in recent years, I've put a lot of time into thinking about this and addressing this. And this, again, is really the framework for our Indigenous Trauma and Resilience Research Center. And when I think about the idea of historical trauma, we can draw a line between history and our current day chronic disease disparities. And a part of that equation is the forced boarding school experiences. So when our people were put onto reservations, the people became dependent on the federal government for food programs because the food sovereignty was essentially gone. So for populations that were hunters and gatherers or farmers, if they did not have their historical territory, they had no longer access to traditional foods. So when people became dependent on government rations for food, this was part of the, for lack of a better word, the kind of the playbook for British colonization, is that the families were told, either give up your children to go to boarding school, or we will withhold your food rations. So basically, give up your children or starve was the option. And this is not ancient history. My own mother is a survivor of boarding schools. And many of our Indigenous faculty members here at UND have parents who were boarding school survivors. So there's really a lot of documentation of the negative impact of the boarding schools on the health of our people, and how the children they had to suffer through abuse and neglect and all other kinds of challenges. And just in May, there was a boarding school report that was put forth by the Department of the Interior. So I'd really encourage you to take a look at that report if you want to learn more about the boarding school history and some of those challenges. It's difficult reading because it's not a very happy part of our history, but has ongoing negative impact on the health of our people. So much of historical trauma is really built into the outcomes of boarding school, where children were removed, they were isolated, they were no longer allowed to be American Indians, essentially. They were just assimilated. And at these boarding schools, there were high rates of death among the children. And we don't know why so many children died at boarding school. Of course, we know there were outbreaks of things like tuberculosis and influenza, but it doesn't answer the question as to why so many children died. We might never know what the root cause of that is. But we do know that, if we think about the survivors of this, there's a long-term psychological, emotional, and spiritual impact for children when so many of their friends and playmates were dying at such an unnatural rate. So this picture is from the Carlisle Indian School in Carlisle, Pennsylvania. And almost all of these boarding schools either have a huge marked graveyard like this or unmarked graveyard. And I do a lot of work in Rapid City, South Dakota as well. They're uncovering unmarked graves now in Rapid City at the boarding school. This is a famous picture from Carlisle with one of the class pictures. I have 4 children myself, and I've seen lots of class pictures. I usually see smiling and laughter and joy. And I look at the faces here and I don't see any of that. I see a lot of fear. I see a lot of anger. I see sadness. And I just feel for these beautiful little children who are enduring this. But that's part of US history that's not very well described, I think, to the general population, is that we had entire generations of Indigenous peoples put through this type of experience. And that has a long lasting impact on the individuals who endured it, but also their descendants. So this is a famous picture of a young Navajo man who, as he entered boarding school on the left, and then 3 years later, and this was kind of billed as a success story of the boarding school. It's like, look, he's no longer Indian. And trying to take the culture out of us was really the goal. So how does this have an impact across generations? And one of our other research centers is an epigenomics research center right here at UND. And one of the things that we see when people are enduring toxic stress, it can change the DNA. So we can actually have a methyl group or a single carbon molecule attached to the nucleotides of the DNA. So when people are under toxic stress, it can actually change their DNA and change expression of the DNA. So it can have an impact on even the body's ability to make proteins. So there's been some animal models that show these changes in DNA can pass from one generation to the next. So it's quite possible that epigenetics will provide a scientific platform to better understand intergenerational trauma. And as I will discuss, that's part of our research project as well. Going along this continuum and thinking about exposure to unhealthy foods, the WIC program, Women, Infants, and Children program, they made a lot of improvements in recent years, but when I was a full-time clinician, the WIC program on the reservation where I worked was basically a baby formula distribution center. So basically just handing out baby formula. And we know the science and the data show us that as a population, formula-fed babies grow up to have higher rates of heart disease and diabetes than breastfed babies. So I think inadvertently, having widespread WIC programs in impoverished communities led to higher rates of formula feeding, and not surprisingly, higher rates of chronic disease in adulthood. The FDPIR is the Food Distribution Program on Indian Reservations. It's the commodity food program. And the commodity food program historically was very unhealthy. So it's things like vegetable shortening, sugar sweetened juices, sugar, flour, and lard, and those types of things. You know, now when we think of traditional American Indian food, a lot of people think of fry bread, right? Indian fry bread. Well, there's just so much irony in that because, you know, we're not really Indians because that's Columbus being lost, and fry bread is not our traditional food. We never fried dough. It's basically people doing the best that they can with their commodities. So the elder on the right, you can see she's using commodity flour and commodity shortening to make fry bread. So it's interesting when I go home for a ceremony or for a feast, you know, back to South Dakota, there's always an expectation that there will be fry bread. And I ask, well, why is that? And people say, because it's traditional. And I always like to point out, you know, it's not traditional American Indian food. If it's traditional USDA food. You know, that's people doing the best they can with their commodities. But this really is poison. You know, it's a really unhealthy form of carbohydrate. The enriched flour with all the nutrients taken out and just starch. And then vegetable shortening is really engineered to stay solid at room temperature. So it's saturated with hydrogen, and it's a trans fat that causes heart disease. And this is what we're eating now. And we've acculturated it, right? It's now become ours. So part of our truth and a part of our pathway to equity is we need to get rid of fry bread. I mean, when I say that back home, people get angry with me because they love their fry bread, but it's not our food and it's poisoning us. Here's some examples of different commodity foods. The stuff that I grew up, I remember eating these things. There was a canned meat, kind of like a spam-like meat product. Commodity cheese, you know, I hate to admit it, but I like commodity cheese. You know, a lot of people grew up with this and just like the flavor of it. They used to distribute grape juice, which I think was just sugar water with purple food coloring. On the right here, this is a container of corn syrup, which is another engineered food. It's not natural as a sweetener. But if you look closely, it says use in baby formula. So think about that. It's our own USDA encouraging young moms not only to use the corn syrup, but to use it in baby formula. So these foods that are unnatural, that are engineered, and are unhealthy has been a part of our culture, unfortunately, since removal and placement on reservations. So no wonder we have such terrible health disparities, just thinking about food sovereignty. But I also think about what is the nutritional epigenetics? What is the change to DNA when the stressor happens to be unhealthy food? So kind of continuing along that continuum and thinking about adverse childhood experiences, I'm sure many of you are familiar with the ACE study, and that showed that the more adversity a child experiences, the worse the health status is as an adult. And there's an ACE score. The original study looked at 10 domains of adverse childhood experiences. And you have an ACE score of basically 0 to 10, and that's based on the number of types of adverse childhood experiences we experience. And it's a dose-response relationship. The higher the ACE score, the worse the health status is as an adult. So when this study was originally conducted back in the 1990s, the base of the ACE pyramid was adverse childhood experiences. And ACEs lead to disrupted neurodevelopment, impairment of social, emotional, and cognitive development, health risk behaviors, early onset of disease, and early death. But I'm very pleased and proud of my colleagues at the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, specifically in the National Center for Injury Prevention. They have ACEs are no longer at the base of the pyramid. They actually have generational embodiment and historical trauma. So CDC is even recognizing that when there's historical trauma, it creates the social conditions and the local context in which families are at greater risk for adverse childhood experiences. So when I look at this, there's just a whole host of research questions built into the ACE pyramid. And most importantly, the research questions include what can we do about it now? How can we prevent adverse childhood experiences? And for those who have dealt with adverse childhood experiences, what are the interventions that can improve health outcomes? So as I had mentioned, there's basically a dose-response relationship between the number of adverse childhood experiences and the worst health status in adulthood. And that's true for chronic disease as well as mental health considerations and other social factors, including addiction, poverty, and even performance in school and educational attainment. Basically, everything is negatively impacted by adverse childhood experiences. So as we look along this continuum, of course, the adversity does not end at age 18, right? We still see adversity even in adulthood. And when people are living in impoverished conditions and dealing with toxic stress and marginalization, that has an impact on health. So the toxic stress can go all the way from previous generations through childhood and adulthood. And another consideration is that children who have gone through adversity and abuse and neglect eventually become parents, right? So what have they learned about parenting? So when I look at this continuum, and again, this really is the basis framework for our Indigenous Trauma and Resilience Research Center. I look at this and in many ways it's heartbreaking, right? There's just so much trauma and so many challenges. But another way to look at this is look at the dozens and dozens of potential research questions. And the research questions include, how do we prevent adverse childhood experiences? What is the impact of commodity foods on nutritional epigenetics? What can we do to mitigate the impact of trauma, toxic stress, adverse childhood experiences? And what can we do to promote improved parenting outcomes and stop the cycle of adverse childhood experiences? What is the impact of reintroducing traditional foods and replacing the things like infant formula and commodity foods? And again, there's just dozens and dozens of research questions built into this framework. So we're addressing a few of those currently. One of our projects that's headed by Dr. Ursula Runningbear, who is Chichangu Lakota from Rosebud, she's looking at boarding school survivors and their children, their adult children, and what is the impact of boarding school on measures of stress, measures of inflammation, and epigenetics. Another one of our projects led by Dr. Andrew Williams is looking at stress during pregnancy and what is the impact of stress during pregnancy on the health of the mothers and the babies as they go through stressful pregnancies. Another project is looking at traditional food. There's a traditional food that we're assessing for its impact on reversing epigenetics. And the preliminary studies are really powerful, looking at the ability of this traditional food to actually demethylate DNA. We've been able to show that in cell culture. Now we're testing it in people. And it's a clinical trial, but it's basically adding this particular food, it's chokeberry. So adding chokeberry juice to the diet and see what is the health impact measured at the level of DNA and the level of inflammation. So those are just three of our initial projects, but you can see there's just so many areas that we need to have a better understanding of, and that's why we have our Indigenous Trauma and Resilience Research Center. Very briefly, one of the other preliminary studies was the South Dakota Health Survey. I was the co-principal investigator on the South Dakota Health Survey about 8 years ago. And we collected data on demographics, self-reported health status. We also did mental health screening. So not self-report of mental health challenges, but actually screening for risk for things like depression, anxiety, and alcohol use disorder, post-traumatic stress disorder. So some of the tools included for those who are methodologists, we use like the PHQ-2 for depression, the GAD-2 for generalized anxiety disorder, Audit C for alcohol use disorder. And we also included the adverse childhood experiences questionnaire. So we engaged all the tribes in South Dakota. 7 of the 9 tribes in South Dakota participated. We wound up getting over 8,000 surveys completed. And of that number, well over 500 American Indians completed the survey. So the demographics of our population that was included in the study was very consistent with our census data. We have a much younger population Our death rate is high, so is our birth rate. So as a result, we have less elders on balance and many more young people because of high death rate and high birth rate. And we also had other types of demographic factors that were consistent with census data. So significantly worse unemployment, significantly lower income, and significantly lower educational attainment for the American Indian population. So this is a population that's at higher risk for public health disparities, but it's consistent with census data. And I know this slide's a little bit busy, but each grouping of bars represents different populations. And on the far right, the light blue bars is the reservation-based populations. And this is for screening for mental health diagnoses. And when we screen for depression, anxiety, and post-traumatic stress, the reservation-based populations had significantly higher positive screening for depression, anxiety, and PTSD. When we look at the domains of adverse childhood experiences, again, I mentioned there's 10 types or 10 domains of ACEs in the original research study. So measures of abuse, neglect, and household dysfunction. And a p-value of less than 0.05 is statistically significant. So we can see for each of the 10 measures, the American Indian population had statistically significantly worse adverse childhood experiences. So that's looking at each measure individually. So not surprisingly, the overall ACE score was significantly worse for American Indians. So a couple things to point out here. The goal really is to have 0 ACEs, right? To try to eliminate adversity during childhood. For American Indians, only 17% had 0 ACEs, whereas 50% of the non-American Indian population had 0 ACEs. So, I mean, ideally that'd be even higher than 50% at 0, but those were the numbers that we had, 17% versus 50%. Once you get above 3 to 4 ACEs, the health disparities really just skyrocket. We see almost like an exponential worsened health status once you have more than 3 or 4 adverse childhood experiences. But look at the scores of 6 or greater. You know, for American Indians, over 19%. So there were more American Indians who had 6 or greater ACEs than those who had 0. This is remarkable. Whereas the non-American Indian population was less than 4% had 6 or more ACEs. We had some respondents who had ACE scores of 10, meaning they had experienced every type of adverse childhood experience in their questionnaire. One of the outcomes of this, and we're about to publish these data, it's looking at disparities in age and death. I know it's a little bit of a busy slide, but the blue bars represent the American Indian population, and the red bars are the white population here in North Dakota. On the x-axis, that's the age of death going from 0 to over 100. On the y-axis, that's the percentage of deaths. And if you look at infant mortality, we can see that about 3.7, 3.8% of all deaths were among infants for American Indians in North Dakota, whereas it's about 0.7 for the white population. So significantly worse infant mortality. And we know that for moms who have high ACE scores, they tend to have worse infant mortality rates as well. And then look at it's almost like 2 separate populations, isn't it? And you see a peak. The average age of death for American Indians in this decade is 2009 to 2019. So before the pandemic, that decade, the average age of death for American Indians was 59, and for the white population, 79. So about a 20-year difference in average age of death. And those causes of early death correlate with unresolved trauma and adverse childhood experience. So if we think again about trying to heal and to recover, we have all kinds of interventions that are not adequately scaled or adequately documented or tested in American Indian populations. So we think about recovery spiritually, just having prayer and reconnection, and that connectedness with each other is so important, and connectedness to place, connectedness to ceremony, connectedness to culture, all has a positive impact on health. In the mental realm, meditation and mindfulness, there's really promising studies looking at mindfulness and what we think about having an impact on our physiology. CBT is cognitive behavioral therapy, And there are traditional American Indian interventions that are basically cognitive behavioral therapy. Even guided imagery is very similar to many of our traditional healing systems. In the physical realm, just movement is healthy for us. And we have some communities that don't have safe places that you can go for a walk. There might not be sidewalks, for example. And then in the emotional realm, we know that social connectedness has a positive impact on health and social isolation has a negative impact. So we need to look at this holistically and recognize that we have a lot of strengths in our traditional ways of looking at health from a holistic perspective, and that those cultural interventions, many of us believe and know that they are effective, but the only way we're going to get resources to support them is to have evidence-based practices. That's part of our role through this Trauma and Resilience Research Centers to build that evidence base. And then just thinking about the whole idea of recovery and improving from chronic disease or addiction and other challenges, that we have to recover in a holistic way as well. And when I think about our needs in American Indian health and our challenges, there's not going to be a pill that's going to fix this, right? The solutions are not just in the pharmacy. The solutions are in culture, in spirituality, and in holism. And I love the word recovery, because at the root of that is to cover. And we've had blanket ceremonies for many, many generations that are considered healing ceremonies, and that sense of safety, that sense of health, that sense of well-being, that sense of belonging, just from something as simple as a blanket ceremony, being honored in this way. And we do this for our graduates now, whether it's South Dakota State University nursing programs, NDSU MPH programs, our own InMed programs. This is just from the Wachipi or the powwow from a couple months ago. Yes, Jan, very good. You can see your former classmates from NDSU, very good. But yes, and then these are students who just graduated from UND, and that they're part of this society of healers that we're wanting to build out. And that's part of our role. And this, in closing, I'll just talk a little bit about equality versus equity and wanting to promote health equity. And what I see in modern medicine is we kind of take a one-size-fits-all approach to healthcare. So everyone has the same formulary or the same access to types of medication, or the Medicaid plan is the same for everybody, whether or not it meets their needs. So in equality, everyone gets the same package of services. So you can see in this example on the left, the guy didn't need it. It's serving the guy in the middle pretty well. The guy on the right is still underserved. In equity, we're not just looking at the process, we're looking at the outcomes. We want equitable health across the board, even if that means that some individuals and some populations need unique services. And that's okay, that's normal, right? That not everyone is the same. One size does not fit all. So with an equity approach, we have to recognize that some populations have unique histories, like American Indians. Some populations have unique healing traditions and cultures and languages, and that needs to be incorporated into the solution, because we can't just expect that a one-size-fits-all approach where a program has been effective in New York City or Atlanta, and we just expect that it will work in Kyle, South Dakota. It might, but it might not. So part of our role in this research center is to identify the types of solutions that are needed within our communities, even if they are unique solutions. So I've been showing this image for a number of years. And a few years ago, someone sent me a picture that I think is just brilliant. And the question is, why is that fence there in the first place, right? Is it just a package of services that we need to overcome the barrier? Or do we just need to get rid of the systemic barrier? And I would say that part of our systemic barrier includes lack of appropriate research that incorporates culture in a culturally meaningful and relevant way, but that's also scientifically sound. And we can bring these worlds together, and that's really our goal for this research center, but also through our PhD in Indigenous health, and recognizing that there's a lot of work that's left to be done, but this is a starting point to try to look at our health disparities, but even more importantly, recognizing the strength and resilience of our cultures and incorporating that into the research program. So I'll go ahead and pause there. It's a lot of information all at once. I did want to leave a few minutes to see if there's any questions or comments. And You can either put them in the chat or even raise your hand if you have any questions or comments. And not all at once. See any hands up or any questions? Oh, here we go. Yeah, Tanya, please go ahead.
Thank you for your great talk. As always, I wanted to ask about measuring land connectedness. As you know, I'm one of the PhD students in Indigenous health, and a study that we're designing is looking at land connectedness and physical health outcomes. So one of the critiques we had is that measurement for chronic diseases like heart disease is rather distal if you try to measure land connectedness. So we talked about perhaps how we can do that by looking at protective factors for those health diseases. I'm just wondering if you have any insights about how you would measure that loss of land connectedness in people today.
Yeah, Tanya, just excellent question, because that's part of what's unique, right, about Indigenous peoples is that different level of deep-rooted connectedness to place and to land, that positionality. And I don't know yet of any validated scientific instruments that can measure that effectively. It might exist, I haven't come across it myself, but that's exactly the type of work that's needed, is to develop the appropriate types of survey tools or instruments that we can then use to assess what is the degree, how do we quantify our connectedness to land and to place. And there are processes that we can use for scientifically sound validation of survey instruments. And there's some examples of that. There's some really good surveys that have been validated that look at cultural connectedness. And from my perspective, we could use very similar types of processes to measure land and place connectedness. But that's exactly the type of work that's needed. And that's exactly why we have a PhD in Indigenous health, is that the non-Indigenous world is not going to ask these questions for us, right? We need to do that, but we also have to have the scientific tools to do it appropriately. So I'm excited to see that project move forward, Tanya. And it's so exciting if we can actually have a validated instrument where we can measure and quantify the degree of land connectedness and how might that have an impact on health outcomes. A great project. All right. Oh, and then some other questions in the chat. And I really appreciate all the kind comments. And yeah, so just even thinking of ACEs and the focus of PACEs. And so Brianne, if you don't mind, if you, either in the chat or if you don't mind just unmuting, just say, kind of describe ACEs and PACEs.
So PACEs is, I guess, the next iteration, possibly, that I'm hearing my students talk about increasingly as they're working on their capstone projects. And actually seeing this increasingly also in, continuing ed trainings and these kinds of things. So my understanding of PACEs is that it takes, it rather than a deficit approach, it takes more of a resilience approach in treatment, and looks not only at what the impact has been from the traumatic events, but also what potential coping and resilience factors the individual may have or will have developed. And I'm just curious to know whether or not you're seeing any of this coming through in treatment, or if it's coming through maybe in a different package.
Excellent question. Yeah, so looking at positive and adverse experiences, and that's really the at the root of this center is that we're not just looking at the adversity and trauma and the disparities, but also the strengths and the resilience and the positive outcomes that we can put forth. I've had really good discussions with the original investigators of the ACE study, particularly Dr. Anda, and he's even recognized and acknowledged that the original ACE study isn't necessarily ideal for all populations, including Indigenous peoples. So, for example, there are other types of adverse experiences that might not be captured in the original ACE study. But in addition to that, what's the interaction when you have really positive outcomes? So perhaps you have one child who has both maybe an ACE score of 2, but no cultural connectedness, and another child with an ACE score of 2, but really strong connectedness culturally. What is the difference, and what might be the differences in outcomes? And many of us really believe that having that protective effect of cultural connectedness can help to mitigate some of the adversity. So we need to develop and test and validate additional instruments, one that are Indigenous and community specific, but also looking at the positive experiences too, because we can't just assume that just adding up all the negative is capturing the entire picture when we have other potentially positive and resilience measures that need to be incorporated. So excellent point, Brianna. I really appreciate that.
Thank you.
Great. And then in the chat, I see Terrell Iron Eyes. Yes, and looking at the dams along the Missouri River, you know, for many of our populations across that entire Missouri River, there's just a series of dams for water preservation. But that flooded a lot of traditional lands, sacred lands, farmlands, burial sites, ceremonial sites. And many of us really do believe that there's an intergenerational impact of that type of loss as well. So Terrell, thank you very much for pointing that out for us too. All right. Wow, that was a very fast hour from my perspective. Hope so for you too. But just really appreciate everybody's participation. And this is the first of our series of seminar discussions focused on these topic areas, and just really appreciate everyone participating, and we'll make sure that each of you is on our listserv for future discussions. And I do see there's a question about how can people outside the program help with our research, and what we can do is perhaps in one of our future seminars discuss exactly that. What is it we can do to build more community-based collaborations and partnerships to address these challenges? So it's not just one research center, but it really is immersed within the community. So if that's okay, I think for Sandy Bates, we'll include that as a topic area for one of our future discussions, and what you can do very directly. All right. Well, I guess it's to the end of our time frame together, and you have our email information if you need to reach us. And Dr. Beisfinger, any last thoughts or comments before we break here?
Thank you, Dr. Warren, and thank you to all of the attendees. I just put our acknowledgement statement to NIGMS in the chat box. And yeah, stay tuned. Our next seminar is to be scheduled, but yeah, probably in the fall. I'll send the invitation to the same mailing list.
Very good. And I really thank you all so much. And thank you to NIH for the wonderful support of these types of projects. Have a good afternoon.